Nobody noticed the child until the room decided he didn't belong there. The words hadn't been spoken aloud, but Emily Carter felt them anyway as she stepped through the quiet luxury of the restaurant where crystal lights reflected off polished marble and conversation softened the moment the billionaire entered. Daniel Kim had arrived 15 minutes earlier, unchanged by the attention of the room, his presence controlled, precise, unreadable. But what held Emily's attention wasn't him. It was the boy standing slightly behind him, Ethan Kim, who seemed disconnected from everything around him as if the world had turned its volume down just for him. While guests pretended not to stare, their discomfort grew in subtle ways. Chairs shifting away, glances exchanged, silence tightening like a rope no one admitted was there. Emily noticed everything. She always did. A glass of water trembled slightly near a table as laughter rose too quickly and died too abruptly, and no one moved to help the boy who had not spoken a word since entering. Daniel Kim spoke quietly to a manager, his tone controlled but distant, as if solving a logistical problem rather than addressing a child, and Emily caught fragments. Keep things smooth, no disruption, just dinner. Words that made the air feel colder than the air conditioning ever could. Ethan stood still, hands loosely folded, eyes lowered not from sadness alone but from a learned habit of staying small in spaces that did not know what to do with him. Emily set her tray down with careful precision, her movements steady even as something inside her shifted, a quiet decision forming without permission. She walked forward. Not quickly, not dramatically, just forward, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to cross an invisible boundary everyone else was avoiding. Daniel noticed her immediately, his posture tightening, his voice sharpening as he stepped slightly between her and the boy, asking in a low tone what she thought she was doing, the kind of question meant to restore order rather than invite explanation. But Emily didn't stop. She lowered herself slowly until she was at Ethan's eye level, ignoring the weight of every stare behind her, and spoke softly as if the entire room had disappeared, asking him if he liked music. The question hung in the air longer than it should have, confusing the rhythm of the room, and for a moment nothing happened. Ethan didn't respond. The guests waited for awkwardness, for correction, for someone to remove the interruption, but instead Emily stayed still, her presence not demanding anything, only offering space. Daniel's expression hardened, ready to intervene again, but then Ethan's fingers moved slightly, not in rejection, but in consideration, as if deciding whether this moment was safe enough to exist in. Emily extended her hand gently, not forcing, not insisting, simply waiting, and in that quiet pause something shifted so subtly that most people missed it. The first sign that the world didn't have to stay exactly as it was. And then, almost imperceptibly, Ethan reached out. The moment Ethan's fingers touched Emily's hand, the entire atmosphere of the restaurant shifted in a way no one in the room could immediately explain, as if the sound itself had softened and every conversation had been pulled into a distant background hum that no longer mattered. Emily did not smile in triumph or look around for approval. She simply held steady, giving the boy a sense of presence rather than pressure, and when he finally stood with her, it was not with confidence but with cautious curiosity, like someone testing whether the ground would remain solid beneath his feet. Daniel Kim took a half step forward instinctively, his instincts as a father colliding with his instincts as a man who controlled every variable in his life. But for the first time that evening he found himself unsure whether intervention was protection or interruption. Around them, guests who had been watching out of discomfort now watched out of disbelief, because what they were seeing did not fit into the structure of their expectations. A child who had been ignored seconds earlier now standing at the center of attention without fear, and a waitress who should have been invisible now holding the emotional center of the entire room. Emily gently adjusted her stance, not pulling Ethan into anything, only matching his pace as if giving him permission to exist at his own rhythm, and she asked him again in a soft voice if he could feel the music through his feet, not expecting an answer but offering a bridge. Ethan did not speak, but he moved slightly, a small shift of weight that most people would have missed. Yet Emily acknowledged it as if it were the most important response in the world. Daniel's expression changed subtly as he observed this, confusion giving way to something more unsettled, because he had spent years surrounded by specialists, advisors, and environments designed to optimize outcomes, yet none of them had ever created a moment like this. One of the managers approached from a distance, clearly uncertain whether to intervene, but stopped when Daniel raised a hand without looking away from his son, signaling a rare pause in authority rather than enforcement. Emily began to guide Ethan into a slow, simple movement, not a performance and not a spectacle, just a gentle rhythm that matched the faint background music drifting through the room, and something in Ethan's posture began to soften, not dramatically, but enough to notice that the tension he carried in his shoulders was not as rigid as before. Daniel watched as his son took another step, then another, each movement hesitant but real, and for reasons he could not immediately articulate. His throat tightened slightly as he realized this was the first time in a long time that he was not trying to fix or manage his son, but simply witnessing him. The room remained silent, not from instruction but from collective uncertainty, as if everyone understood they were observing something that did not belong to their usual categories of judgment or entertainment. Emily finally looked up at Daniel briefly, not with defiance or apology, but with calm certainty, as if to remind him that control was not always the same as care, before returning her focus entirely to Ethan, who for the first time that night allowed himself to move without hesitation. As Ethan's steps began to align with the soft rhythm Emily was guiding him into, the space around them seemed to compress into something quieter, as if the entire restaurant had forgotten how to breathe properly, and Daniel Kim stood still at the edge of that moment, no longer issuing instructions, no longer correcting outcomes, only watching a version of his son he had never been taught how to interpret. Ethan's movements were not perfect, they were uneven and careful, but they were intentional, and that alone carried a weight that made several guests instinctively lower their voices without knowing why. Emily did not rush him, she simply matched his pace, her hand occasionally lifting slightly to guide rather than control, and in doing so she created a rhythm that belonged to neither the staff nor the guests but to something more human and less defined. Daniel's jaw tightened as he realized how many professionals had told him they understood his son, how many consultations, evaluations, and carefully structured environments had promised progress, yet none of them had ever produced this kind of moment, where Ethan was not being corrected but being included. A faint sound of music from the restaurant speakers became more noticeable now, not louder but clearer, as if attention itself had tuned into it, and Ethan turned his head slightly toward it, following a pattern only he seemed to recognize. Emily noticed immediately and adjusted her movement, turning the interaction into something closer to a shared observation than instruction, allowing him to lead without pressure. Daniel took a slow step closer, then stopped again, as if afraid that moving too quickly might break something fragile and unseen. For the first time, his authority did not feel useful in this space, and that realization unsettled him more than any business failure ever could. A guest at a nearby table whispered something, then stopped mid-sentence when another guest gently signaled for silence, as if everyone had unconsciously agreed that interrupting this moment would be wrong even if no one could explain why. Ethan took another step, then paused, his eyes flickering briefly toward Emily as if checking whether he was doing it correctly, and she responded not with words of correction but with a calm nod that carried permission instead of judgment. Daniel's expression softened slightly without his permission, the rigid structure of control he had built over years beginning to fracture in small invisible ways, because what he was seeing was not a performance, but a connection forming in real time without instruction or expectation. Emily slowly extended her other hand, not to take control, but to offer balance, and Ethan accepted it hesitantly, which made the entire motion feel even more significant, like something rare and unrepeatable. The distance between father and son narrowed by a few steps, not physically but emotionally, as Daniel found himself no longer focused on outcomes or explanations, but on the simple fact that his son was present in a way he had rarely seen before. And in that suspended silence, where no one in the room dared to interfere, the smallest movements carried the greatest meaning, as if the world had briefly agreed to stop judging and simply observe. The moment Emily adjusted her hand to steady Ethan, a subtle shift passed through the restaurant that even the most distracted guests could feel, as if the air itself had changed density, and Daniel Kim stood a few steps behind them, no longer trying to control the situation but instead absorbing it with a kind of stillness that felt unfamiliar to him. Ethan continued moving in small, careful patterns, following the rhythm only he seemed to sense, while Emily maintained a calm presence beside him, never forcing direction, only offering stability whenever his confidence wavered. A nearby glass clinked softly as a waiter passed, and even that ordinary sound felt amplified in the silence that had taken over the room, where conversations had nearly dissolved into whispers or stopped entirely. Daniel's attention was fixed on his son's face now, not on the movement or the environment, but on the subtle changes in expression that he had rarely seen in such clarity, a flicker of focus, a moment of recognition, and something that resembled ease rather than tension. Emily noticed Daniel watching, and for a brief moment their eyes met again. But there was no challenge in her expression, only calm certainty, as if she was reminding him without words that understanding did not always require intervention. Ethan shifted his weight slightly closer to her, and she responded instantly by matching his pace, reinforcing the fragile rhythm they had created together. The guests around them began to realize that this was not a performance meant to entertain, but a private moment unfolding in public space, and that realization made them even quieter. Daniel slowly stepped forward another half step, this time not stopping himself immediately, as if something inside him was beginning to accept that proximity was no longer a threat but a possibility. Ethan's movements became slightly more confident, still imperfect but less hesitant, and Emily allowed that growth without drawing attention to it, keeping the focus entirely on the boy's experience rather than the observation of others. A faint reflection of light moved across the polished floor as staff shifted positions, but no one interrupted, not even the manager who had earlier seemed ready to intervene, because even authority had begun to hesitate in the presence of something it could not categorize. Daniel finally spoke, but his voice was no longer sharp, instead lower and uncertain, asking if his son was all right, not as an instruction but as a question he genuinely needed answered in that moment. Ethan did not respond verbally, but he did not withdraw either, and that absence of retreat was enough to hold meaning. Emily gently guided Ethan through another small sequence of steps, then slowly released her hand for a moment to see if he would continue independently, and when he did, even briefly, a shift passed through Daniel's expression that could not be easily defined as anything other than recognition. The idea that progress did not always look like achievement but sometimes like participation seemed to land in him for the first time without resistance. Around them, the restaurant remained suspended in silence, no longer driven by curiosity but by an unspoken awareness that something delicate was unfolding that did not belong to their usual understanding of order or normality, and in that suspended moment, every second felt longer than the last, as if time itself had slowed to make space for something quietly transformative. The silence that had taken over the restaurant now felt heavier, not because anything had changed in volume, but because every movement inside the room had become meaningful, as if even the smallest gesture carried consequences that no one wanted to interrupt, and Ethan remained at the center of it, still moving with Emily Carter in a rhythm that was no longer uncertain but slowly becoming familiar. Daniel Kim stood a few feet away, his posture no longer rigid but slightly softened, as though he was witnessing something that did not require control, only attention. Ethan's steps were still careful, but they no longer paused after every shift of weight, and that subtle continuity created a sense of progress that could not be measured in conventional terms but was clearly visible in the way his shoulders lowered just slightly from their earlier tension. Emily did not speak much now, she only adjusted her pace when necessary, offering silent confirmation whenever Ethan's focus wavered, and that restraint itself seemed to carry more power than instruction ever could. Around them, guests remained frozen in observation, some leaning slightly forward without realizing it, others holding their breath as if afraid that any sudden noise might break something fragile and important. Daniel's eyes followed every small change in his son's movement, and for the first time in a long while, he was not evaluating outcomes or efficiency, but simply presence, the fact that Ethan was here, engaged, and not withdrawn into himself. A faint sound from the music system shifted in tone, almost unnoticed, but Ethan responded to it instinctively, turning his head slightly before adjusting his steps again, and Emily matched that shift immediately, reinforcing the connection without directing it. Daniel took another slow step forward, closing the distance until he was only a few feet away, and this time he did not stop himself, as if something in him had begun to accept that proximity did not necessarily mean interference. Ethan briefly glanced in his direction but did not retreat, and that single moment of sustained presence between father and son carried a weight that made Daniel's breath catch slightly, though he did not speak. Emily finally paused her movement, not to end anything, but to allow Ethan to continue on his own, and for a brief moment he did, taking 2 small steps without guidance before hesitating again, testing the space around him as if checking whether it would hold. Daniel's expression shifted subtly, the tension in his jaw easing as he realized that what he was seeing was not correction or training, but participation, something far simpler and yet far more difficult to achieve. One of the guests quietly lowered their phone that had been recording, as if suddenly aware that documenting this moment felt inappropriate, and that shift spread silently through the room, reducing even curiosity into stillness. Emily looked briefly toward Daniel again, not asking for approval and not seeking acknowledgement, but simply grounding the moment in calm awareness, before returning her attention to Ethan as he took another careful step forward, now less hesitant than before. And in that shared silence between all of them, the distance that had defined the beginning of the evening began to feel slightly less absolute, as if something unspoken had started to reshape what was possible. The final moments of that quiet movement unfolded in a way that no one in the room could later describe with precision, only with feeling, as if something had happened that existed outside of language itself, and Ethan stood now in the center of the restaurant floor with less hesitation in his posture than before, his steps no longer fragmented but gently connected, while Emily Carter slowly reduced her guiding presence to give him full space to continue on his own. Daniel Kim remained only a few feet away, and yet the emotional distance he had carried into the evening felt like it had been quietly reduced without explanation, not through words or decisions, but through what he had witnessed in silence. Ethan paused once more, glancing briefly toward Emily as if checking for permission, and she responded not with instruction but with a calm nod that confirmed he did not need to stop. That single moment seemed to unlock something further. As Ethan resumed movement with a slightly steadier rhythm, his attention no longer fragmented by uncertainty, but anchored by something unfamiliar yet safe. Daniel's expression shifted again, subtle but undeniable, as he realized his son was not simply responding to an environment, but engaging with it in real time, and that realization carried a weight he did not immediately try to control or analyze. The surrounding guests remained still, their earlier discomfort replaced by a kind of restrained awe that made even their breathing seem measured, as if any sudden interruption might erase what they were witnessing. Emily finally stepped back fully, lowering her hand completely, signaling that she was no longer guiding but observing, and Ethan continued for a few more steps on his own before slowing naturally, not because he had failed, but because he was choosing when to pause. Daniel moved forward at last, closing the remaining distance until he stood directly within Ethan's line of sight, and for a moment neither of them spoke or moved, simply existing in the same space without avoidance. Ethan looked at him, and though there were no dramatic expressions or sudden changes, there was recognition, not of instruction or authority, but of presence. Daniel lowered himself slightly, matching his son's eye level, breaking a pattern he had likely never broken in a public setting before, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the earlier control, only quiet uncertainty asking if Ethan was all right. Ethan did not answer verbally, but he did not turn away either, and that absence of withdrawal carried its own meaning that seemed to settle between them. Emily, now standing a short distance away, watched without intervening, her role in the moment complete not because she had resolved anything, but because she had allowed space for something to occur naturally. The restaurant remained silent, not from instruction but from collective understanding that what had just happened could not be replicated or rushed, and as the evening light outside began to fade slightly through the tall windows, the space between father and son felt less like separation and more like possibility. In the final stretch of that quiet moment, the restaurant felt as if it had been suspended outside of normal time, where even the faint clinking of glassware sounded distant and softened, and Ethan stood at the center of it all with a calmness that had not existed when the evening began. Daniel Kim remained close, no longer as a distant authority figure but as a father trying to understand a space that had suddenly become unfamiliar to him, while Emily Carter stood slightly apart, her presence no longer active in guiding but still anchoring the atmosphere with a quiet stability. Ethan shifted his weight once more, and for the first time his movement was not prompted by hesitation or uncertainty but by simple continuation, as if his body had begun to trust the space around him. Daniel slowly raised his hand, pausing halfway before gently placing it near Ethan's shoulder without gripping or directing, and that small gesture carried more emotional weight than any instruction he had given all evening. Ethan looked at him briefly, then back to the open space in front of him, and took another step on his own, steady but still careful, as if testing a reality he had not fully believed in before. Around them, guests remained silent, not from confusion anymore but from recognition that something meaningful had unfolded without spectacle, something that did not require explanation to be understood at a human level. Emily finally turned her gaze away slightly, allowing the moment to belong fully to them now, as her role shifted from participant to observer, and Daniel's breathing slowed as he realized he was no longer trying to fix or correct, but simply to be present. Ethan paused again, then stepped forward once more, and this time Daniel matched his movement not by leading, but by walking beside him at a respectful distance, mirroring rather than directing. The shift was subtle but profound, as if the distance between them had changed from separation into shared space. Emily took a slow step back, creating more room around them, and the room itself seemed to respond by remaining still, as if any interruption would break something delicate that no one fully understood but everyone felt. Daniel finally spoke again, but this time his voice carried no authority, only quiet acknowledgement, telling Ethan that he was doing well, and the words did not command or evaluate, they simply existed as support. Ethan did not respond, but his posture softened slightly, and that small change was enough to shift the emotional center of the moment even further. Emily observed this without expression, as if confirming to herself that sometimes intervention was not about changing outcomes, but about allowing conditions where outcomes could change naturally. The restaurant, once filled with the usual noise of service and conversation, remained in a suspended silence that felt almost reverent, and as the evening light dimmed further through the tall windows, what remained was not a spectacle, but a quiet redefinition of what connection could look like when no one was trying to control it. The silence that had settled over the restaurant now felt less like tension and more like understanding, as if the entire space had quietly agreed to hold itself still for just a little longer, and Ethan remained at the center of it, no longer isolated but no longer performing, simply existing in a way that felt more grounded than when the evening began. Daniel Kim stood beside him at a careful distance, not reaching for control, not issuing direction, only matching presence with presence, and in that simple adjustment something in his posture finally eased in a way that was almost imperceptible but deeply real. Ethan took another small step forward, then paused, not out of hesitation but out of awareness, as if he was now choosing his own rhythm rather than following any external cue, and Daniel mirrored him gently, reducing the gap between them by a fraction without forcing it. Emily Carter remained a few steps behind now, no longer part of the movement itself, but fully aware of every shift happening in front of her, her expression calm and steady, as if she understood that her role had already reached its natural conclusion. Around them, the guests had stopped reacting entirely, no longer whispering or adjusting their positions, simply watching with an attention that had transformed from curiosity into recognition, as though something unspoken had clarified itself in real time. Ethan turned slightly toward his father, his eyes meeting Daniel's for a brief moment longer than before, and in that moment there was no urgency, no expectation, only acknowledgement of shared space. Daniel lowered his gaze slightly to match his son's level, not as an authority but as a participant, and the gesture carried a quiet sincerity that had not been present earlier in the evening. Ethan did not step away, and that absence of retreat felt more significant than any movement forward, because it marked a shift from avoidance into acceptance of proximity. Emily shifted her weight subtly, her presence now more distant in the composition of the moment, as if she was stepping out of a frame that no longer required her intervention, yet her influence remained embedded in the space they occupied. Daniel finally extended his hand slightly, not to guide or correct, but to offer a point of connection, and after a brief pause Ethan placed his hand into it with careful certainty, not gripping tightly, but enough to confirm the contact. The gesture was small, but it changed the emotional temperature of everything around them, because it was not about control or instruction, but about shared willingness. The room, still silent, seemed to respond by becoming even quieter, as if acknowledging that anything unnecessary would feel out of place now. Emily took one final step backward, allowing the distance between herself and them to increase, signaling that the moment belonged entirely to father and son. Daniel looked down at Ethan's hand in his for a brief moment, then back to his face, and for the first time all evening his expression was not analytical or strategic, but simply present, grounded in what was happening rather than what should happen. Ethan remained steady beside him, no longer searching for cues, no longer testing the environment, simply standing within it. And in that stillness, the evening that had begun with separation and uncertainty settled into something quieter and more complete, not resolved through explanation, but through shared presence that no longer needed to be defined. The room remained still, as if even the air itself was waiting for someone to speak first. The billionaire slowly lowered his phone, no longer interested in any message, any call, or any market update that could compete with what had just happened in front of him. For the first time in years, numbers felt irrelevant. He looked at the woman standing across from him, the waitress who had answered his mock question with precision that no casual observer could fabricate. Her posture was steady, her expression calm, but there was something behind her eyes that suggested she had long since stopped trying to prove herself to people who refused to listen. The billionaire exhaled slowly, almost as if he was recalibrating the way he understood the world. He spoke more quietly now, without the earlier arrogance in his voice. "You were not guessing," he said. "You were not performing. You actually understand this." She placed the notepad gently on the table, as if even that small object deserved respect. "I understand what happens when people assume intelligence only belongs to the ones wearing expensive suits," she replied. Her voice was not emotional, not defensive, only honest. The billionaire leaned back slightly, studying her as though he was seeing a problem he could not solve with data alone. Around them, the restaurant had returned to its normal rhythm, but the meaning of the moment had already changed everything for him. He asked her why she was working there, why someone with that level of financial clarity was serving tables instead of sitting in boardrooms. For a moment she hesitated, not because she lacked an answer, but because she had answered this question too many times to people who never truly heard it. Finally she spoke. She said she had once been on a different path, one that required time, opportunity, and a kind of support system she no longer had access to. Life had forced her into simplicity, but it had never taken away her ability to think. The billionaire did not interrupt. He did not offer assumptions. He simply listened, which was something he realized he had not done in a very long time. When she finished, there was a quiet pause between them, not uncomfortable, but heavy with understanding. He slowly reached into his jacket and pulled out a card, placing it on the table, not sliding it like an offer of power, but setting it down like a question. He told her he was not offering charity, not offering rescue, but offering recognition. A place where her mind would not be wasted. A place where she would be judged by accuracy instead of appearance. She looked at the card without touching it immediately. Then she asked him something unexpected. She asked if he truly believed people like him changed because of one conversation. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he admitted something simpler. That most people in his world never told him the truth without calculating the cost first. She had done it without hesitation. After a long silence, she finally picked up the card. Not as acceptance, but as acknowledgement that the world was bigger than the version she had been forced to live in. She said she would think about it, but she would not promise who she would become for anyone. The billionaire nodded, accepting that answer more respectfully than any agreement he had ever signed. As she walked away, he realized something quietly irreversible had shifted inside him. Not the market, not his company, but his understanding of people. And for the first time in a life built on control, he understood that intelligence did not announce itself loudly. It waited. It observed. And when spoken to with respect, it revealed exactly how small arrogance truly was.